welcome to Afflictions Sugarcoated, a podcast where we sugarcoat some of the world's so-called afflictions and rate their plausibility on a scale of 1 to 5. I'm Minnie Kim, and today we'll be sugarcoating mugshots during the war on crime. Now, this is part of an essay/project that I'm doing for a history class. I'm taking a US history class, and I thought it'd be interesting to share some of this sort of niche, sort of not history with you all, see what you think of it, especially in its pertinence to the status quo. So, here it is. In the following days of April 19th, 1989, Americans across the country opened their newspapers and turned on their televisions to images like Figure 1 and 2, perp walks, and mugshots of 5 black and Latino teenagers, all accused of raping and brutally beating a white jogger in Central Park. Now, the captions of these photos read "suspected" and "accused," while the headlines read "wolf pack" and "two-legged animals." Now, for most Americans, the photos had already settled the question. All 5 of them were convicted, and in 2002, all 5 were exonerated. Now, we'll meet the story again later. But for now, we must recognize that aside from the media spectacle of the Central Park Five, the mugshots and perp walks distributed at the time were not exceptional. Of course, 83% of prominent news stories during 1996 and 1997 were about violent crime, and between the 1960s and the 1990s, the machinery of visual criminalization was so loud, and in the case of the Central Park Five, so wrong, that we now see the products of these numbers. Black people comprised of about 13% of the US population and 40% of the prison population by 2012. And in 1995, when Americans were asked to envision a drug user, 95% pictured a black man, although black Americans only comprised 15% of drug users. Now, these numbers reflect half a century of deliberate image making. This paper examines that image making. We'll explore how political actors weaponize the media and how the media took an active part in creating the above statistics, and in which I argue that during the war on crime era, a structurally white media apparatus selectively produced and circulated visual representation of black suspects, such as mugshots and perp walks, and such representation severely worsens the public perception that the archetype of American criminals are young black men by ridding the innocent until proven guilty narrative and complementing racist language with a visual portrayal, ultimately providing the cultural infrastructure that made mass incarceration sustainable. Now, let's move on to part 1. Just look at those eyes and handcuffs. In 1987, Judge Claude Cahill, a district judge from Missouri, claimed that, quote, "the presumption of innocence is now a legal myth," end quote. Now, in this section, I argue that visual representations contributed to this phenomenon. Let's start with mugshots. Mugshots began in the second half of the 18th century, a time when physiognomy, I think that's how you pronounce it, which argued that certain facial features indicated criminality, was common belief. War on drug and crime mugshots may not have been malintended, but Dr. Jonathan Finn, a visual communications professor, argued that mugshots were often, quote, "deployed as a representational device." In other words, the production of one's identity was inextricably linked to their image. Now, the impacts during the war on crime were twofold: on the law enforcement agencies and the viewers of these mugshots on media. First, mugshots held a lot of credence for law enforcement simply because of the objectivity of the camera. A photo was perhaps the most trustworthy visual representation of someone. Law enforcement could then establish an internal pattern from an individual's photo to the rest of society. Furthermore, professor of law and psychology Steve Penrod explains how prior mugshot exposures decrease accuracies at a subsequent police lineup because there is, quote, "a transference of the identity of the target person to an innocent person." Hence, if a young black man is lined up for a mugshot and officers are exposed to those mugshots, officers are compelled to include a young black man in the next lineup. And this mechanism alters police officers' processes in arresting the next group of criminals. Second, on the impact on the average viewer. Various contemporary scholars, such as Wolf and Grotta, found that large portrait style photographs and 8 action photos pulled newsreaders and watchers, and Baxter et al. Found that photographs help with story recall, indicating the magnitude that a photograph uniquely has. The most detrimental effect, as Dr. Finn explains, is that the pose, framing, and formal conventions of mugshots is taken to indicate criminality. Hence, mugshots are recalled well, are trustworthy mediums of identification, and has a direct link to criminality despite it being taken after arrest, not conviction. Now let's move on to perp walks. A similar story applies to perp walks. The visualization of a handcuffed, dragged, and police surrounded suspect in a raincoat rings far from, quote, presumed innocent. It perhaps communicates even more guilt than mugshots in instances where all three criminal aspects of a perp walk are featured. Furthermore, perp walks are more actively demonstrate law enforcement ties to the media. According to K9, an academically renowned litigator, there are 3 types of perp walks. One is the staged perp walk, where the police takes a suspect out of the police station solely from the request of the press. Now, this type was only found unconstitutional in 2000. The other pertinent is the choreographed walk, in which state agents actively facilitate media access by giving them notice of an arrest or conducting an arrest in a more camera friendly way. Now, these mediums of perp walks actively prove the incentive structure created within law enforcement and the media that thrived from the 60s to the 90s. Now, let's also look at the inherent photography of things. Now, separate from incentives, the apparatus that was being used to take such mugshots and perp walks was just inherently discriminatory. As seen in Figure 3, the quality of the mugshot of a black man is comparably worse than that of a white man. This is because the predominant print manufacturer, Kodak, distributed Shirley cards, standards of printing white people, to each printing business. So the pictures of people with darker skin were often poorly rendered according to the National Gallery of Art. Hence, mugshots and perp walks taken by camera rendered photos to an inferior and less individualized quality. However, photographs of mugshots and perp walks by themselves cannot change Americans' public perception of young black men and erase a legal principle. It sometimes requires viewers to interpret imagery with existing racial assumptions, but other times it takes the effort of controlled circulation by the media to make it into a theater. Now, part 2, they waged war. So, there's a subsection under this part about how racist was America during the war on crime. This section attempts to summarize this question. In 1991, the National Race Survey showed that the majority of Americans believe blacks are aggressive or violent. One of the main reasons cited was civil rights activism that flooded the 60s and 90s. In the same survey, Americans saw that blacks were getting too demanding in their push for equal rights, as it was threatening their advantageous positions. Any negative response toward the police was seen to stimulate crime, according to the Crime Commission. So this gave politicians the perfect climate for their war on crime agenda, as it served as a convenient ride post for whites to growing demands of black Americans, according to Simon. Now, in the following sections, we will see how political activism was portrayed by the media as a medium of black crime. Now, the second subsection begins with, it always begins with big, powerful presence. Although there is no exact event that defines when crime became a politicized issue, a start is the 1964 presidential campaign. Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate, announced that our wives, all women, feel unsafe on our streets, using moral imperatives to create urgency. Here, when Lyndon B. Johnson instead won the election, he too began to preach on the war on crime, even whilst violent crime had actually been declining. From the very beginning, the war on crime was created as a political tactic that contradicted the statistics of crime. President Nixon, however, officially pioneered this greater culture of fear by adding another layer, the war on drugs, or as he called it, public enemy number one. During his campaigns in 1968, Nixon used crime as one of his primary selling points using didactic rhetoric. He argued that doubling the conviction rate in this country would do more than to cure crime in America than quadrupling the funds for the war on poverty, using the fact that Americans were tired of civil rights activism. We see it again in Nixon's 1970 State of the Union address. We must declare and win the war against the criminal elements, he announced, which increasingly threaten our cities, our homes, and our lives. The rhetoric of war used throughout this time period was essentially powerful, as it framed the political situation as a collective evil that all citizens must fight against. Who was this evil? By winning the elections, Republicans saw that racially charged campaigns helped Republicans create a new majority. This fueled incentives for such as anti-black rhetoric to continue, as legal scholar Michelle Alexander argues. In 1981, Reagan announced to the chiefs of police in New Orleans that we must never forget the jungle is always there they're always there waiting to take us over, painting a savage picture of black criminals. This connection was seen in the 1969 New York Times report of violence by reporter James Reston, who concluded that violent crime stems disproportionately from the ghetto slums where most live. Further racial implications were politically manifested in the creation of the Rapid Deployment Unit, which patrolled the black ghetto in search of suspects, i.e., all young black men. Now, we learned two things from this political rhetoric. First, racial tension persisted throughout the decades that allowed all three presidents to win elections by implicating black people. Second, in all three of these phases, crime as a means of affecting everyone in the country, left or right, had the most political and legal consensus of support amongst the people and the government, even if the crisis was not even really a crisis at the time. Indeed, when Reagan announced his war on drugs initiatives in 1992, crack was not a crisis in black neighborhoods. So, how exactly did the media fit into this equation in this evolution of the war on crime/drugs? The media, especially the visual components that followed, are both the product of this political action as well as the cause. How is it the product? The Reagan administration hired staff to publicize crack cocaine in 1985 to help build public and governmental support for the war. This media soon began the images of crack whores, crack dealers, and crack babies, most of them black. Alexander argues that this media bonanza helped to catapult the war on drugs from an ambitious federal policy to an actual war. Indeed, Robert Stutman, a DEA agent, explains how he was sent to give hundreds of presentations to the media to call attention to the drug scourge. Hence, the government clearly pulled the trigger here. But how is it the cause? When the media showed images of black drug addicts while repeating the word war, it became very clear who this enemy of this war was. Although black and white people use marijuana at the same rate, blacks were 4 to 5 times more likely to be arrested. More black addicts appeared on the screen and became the face of drug abuse, changing public and police perception. We will examine this feedback loop in more detail later. Behind every news story is always someone who decides what goes on the screen and what message is conveyed. During the war on crime, that figure was white men. In fact, the lack of diversity in mainstream media is proclaimed by many journalists of color to have heavily influenced criminal justice coverage. Former journalist and professor at GW University Robert Entman argues that TV favors those of higher classes because those persons have the skills and resources to manipulate television production practices. This is to say that there are less incentives for the media to portray those of the lower classes in a positive light. Media did, however, have the incentive to make money. Near the end of the 1960s, the Vietnam War's coverage was wearing out. Institutions needed something that would drive up the audience ratings, and one of the best ways to do that was action news. Of those, crime was especially potent. It was news form with concrete events, impacts, drama, and attention getting visuals. According to Simon, few issues are as likely to keep parents awake for the 11 p.m. local news broadcasts as the latest breaking story on crime in schools. This posed two problems. First, news could easily distort crime to make them more interesting. As Barack argues, something becomes a serious type of crime on the basis of what is going inside these newsrooms, not outside of them, which unfortunately led to condensed explanations of events taken out of context. For example, a social justice riot could easily be interpreted as a rampage. Second, the first aspect that viewers learn about the prime suspect is race or ethnicity and an image. As seen in Figure 4, visuals of stories range mostly from 1 to 10 seconds, which leaves little space for elaboration. Hence, what is remembered, as proven in Part 1, is only an action packed, dramatized crime story with a face of a certain race immediately tied to danger. Now, this concludes the analysis of the incentive structures of the war on crime, specifically black crime, the dangers of photography in Part 1, the political pressure in Part 2, and viewership incentives in Part 3. Now, let us examine how these incentives manifested in the media. So, how did the word criminal come to mean a young black male? How exactly did incarceration become a rite of passage imposed upon African American teenagers, according to sociologist Dorothy Roberts? I named 6 methods in how the media managed this. The first method was to bombard the news with black crime instead of white crime. In 1990, a study found that 76% of all local TV stories about black people were about crime, and the amount of seconds on news programs dedicated to featuring such stories is extraordinary compared to others, as seen in Figure 5. This contrast is especially stark in NYPD statistics, in which of African Americans were suspects in 55% of thefts, and yet were 84% of theft stories in local news. Coupled with the daunting, bolded cover stories regarding crime as seen in some newspaper samples in Figure 6, the sheer amount of crime stories contributed to repeated exposure and the visual association detailed in Part 1. The second method is building the racial vocabulary. Coined by Princeton University's political scientist John J. DeLulio Jr., super predators, although not always directly referenced, represented young black criminals or radically impulsive, brutally remorseless youngsters. This term was used in a New York Times article notifying Americans that there could soon rise again as a generation of super predator juveniles came of age. This issue was released whilst homicide rates had already been dropping, creating unnecessary moral panic. Other examples can be seen in Figure 17, emphasizing the animalization and predatorial nature of criminals. This word became, as Marshall argued, a part of the national vocabulary. Granted, a word cannot hold as much power without a visual aid to inculcate an image into household news and newspapers. This brings us to our third method, black mugshots and handcuffs. Mugshots and perp walks became one of the most popular forms of reporting crime because it was an easily accessible photo that all newsworthy suspects had. Indeed, nearly half of all front page photographs in 5 major newspapers in 1986 were mugs. It has already been established that black suspects are disproportionately featured in crime stories, but more so, black suspects were 2 times more likely to be shown in a perp walk and 4 times more likely to appear in a mugshot in local TV news compared to white suspects. In fact, a study shows that throughout a week, accused black criminals were usually accompanied in news stories with mugshots or perp walks, but none of the white criminals were shown in mugshots nor perp walks. Black criminality was visually racialized in ways that white criminality was simply not. Examples can be seen in Figure 7, featuring a wide variety of black suspects' mugshots, perp walks, and court images that were distributed to news agencies. Figure 9 shows a group of only black defendants accused of riot-related crimes in an LA criminal court. Figure 10 shows a Tampa policeman holding a gun on 4 handcuffs black teenagers in suspicion of looting. Figure 14 shows police amidst tackling a suspected black drug buyer, a common occurrence among whites as well. Figure 11 shows Muhammad Aziz, a suspect in killing Malcolm X, being escorted by police. Figure 12 shows David Bryant, 18, being escorted by police for suspected rape and murder. Figure 13 shows George Whittemore Jr. being walked by the police for the accused stabbing of and killings of 2 white women. All 3 suspects were convicted and later exonerated. Like such, the sheer amount of black suspects' images not only allowed Americans to draw visual connections between crime, but also erased the notion of innocence until proven guilty, as proven in Part 1, creating implications for hundreds of wrongful convicts. So that was part of my paper, but because it's extremely long, I'll just leave you with a bit of a conclusion. And it begins with a quote from Arthur Miller that says, "A good newspaper, I suppose, is a nation talking to itself." Now, the mugshots of the war on crime live on. The Morph database, which uses AI to create facial recognition techniques, houses 55K mugshots, 84.6% of which are African. In other words, AI models are now being trained from the mugshots that are disproportionately representing black suspects, from over-policing more mugshots and more data for FRTs to feed on. In fact, Brian Jefferson claims that many of the digital policing technologies ubiquitous in 2024 were, quote, initially rolled out in the late 1980s in the thick of the war on drugs. Tucker also explains that the use of mugshots as inoperable image data objects are established in direct relation to the American war on drugs. Hence, the gravity of mugshots as well as the mugshots used in modern-day technology can both be attributed to the war on crime. Now, is this frenzy over? Arguably, it is merely morphed. Although news today seems comparatively more, quote, responsible, it has merely changed with the Overton window. The war on crime era perhaps shows a unique period in American history in which the media changed the Overton window, both of political initiatives and culture. Or perhaps the war on crime was not unique at all. It will merely take decades to notice that in every era, powerful images and powerful words can change a nation's culture, and a nation's culture can most definitely change the structures behind the scenes to feed into those same sentiments again and again and again. Now, I give the sugarcoating of mugshots and perp walks during the war on crime a 2. Now, this podcast was written and produced by me, Minnie Kim. If you have any comments or reviews, please feel free to write any and all thoughts in your podcast reviews. If you'd like to suggest an affliction for me to sugarcoat, please email me via afflictionssugarcoated@gmail.com. If you would like to learn more about mugshots and perp walks during the war on crime, I would suggest going to JSTOR or any of the articles. I'm sure they have much more qualified information than what you just heard, and equally as interesting. Alright, I hope to see you next month.